The HOA tried to evict me from my own cabin. No warning. No conversation. Just a legal notice taped to my door. They said my place didn't fit community rules. They said I had 30 days to leave. What they didn't realize was that every summer weekend, their residents parked on land I owned. And the lake they used for boating, fishing, and photos? That wasn't community property. It was mine. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten them. I just waited and let them learn what happens when you try to evict the wrong person. I bought the cabin 12 years ago, back when nobody wanted this place. It sat near the edge of a quiet lake. No paved road. No fancy docks. Just trees, water, and silence. I wanted that silence. The cabin wasn't big. 1 bedroom. A small porch. A fireplace that smoked more than it heated. But it was mine. What most people didn't know was how the land worked. The cabin sat on my parcel. But I also owned the narrow strip of land that led down to the lake. And farther down, near the water, there was an open gravel area. That gravel area eventually became the only usable parking space for the neighborhood that came later. Back then, none of that existed. 5 years after I bought the cabin, construction trucks arrived. Developers started building homes on the other side of the trees. Dozens of them. Then more. Eventually, they formed an HOA. At first, nobody bothered me. I kept to myself. I came on weekends. I fished. I repaired the porch slowly. I waved when neighbors passed. The HOA board changed over time. New people. New rules. That's when things shifted. It started small. A letter about visual harmony. They didn't like the color of my cabin. It was brown. They wanted something lighter. I ignored it. Then another letter. This one said my porch furniture wasn't approved. I still ignored it. I wasn't part of their HOA. My land existed before theirs. My deed was clear. But they didn't see it that way. One afternoon, a woman in a pressed blazer knocked on my door, clipboard in hand. She introduced herself as the HOA president. She smiled like someone used to being obeyed. She said my cabin lowered property values. She said residents complained. I asked which residents. She didn't answer. She said I should consider compliance. I told her I wasn't under their authority. Her smile faded. She said, "We'll see." That was the first warning. A month later, I found orange tape near the gravel parking area. Survey markers. I asked a neighbor what was happening. He shrugged and said the HOA planned to formalize access. That's when I knew they were crossing lines. I pulled out my old documents. Maps. Deeds. Easements. There was no easement for parking. None for lake access either. Years ago, I had verbally allowed people to park there. I didn't mind. It felt neighborly. That kindness became their assumption. Then came the notice. I arrived one Friday evening and saw it taped to my cabin door. A formal eviction notice. They claimed my structure violated HOA regulations. They said it was non-compliant housing. They gave me 30 days to vacate. I laughed at first. Then I felt something colder. They were serious. They weren't asking anymore. They were pushing. I called the number on the letter. The HOA attorney answered. He spoke calmly, confidently. He said the board voted unanimously. He said I could appeal, but enforcement would proceed. I asked him if he reviewed my deed. There was a pause. He said, "We'll address that in due course." That was when I stopped talking. I didn't threaten. I didn't yell. I just stopped explaining myself. Instead, I made calls. A local property attorney. A land surveyor. The county clerk. Within a week, everything was clear. The HOA owned none of the lakefront. None of the parking area. None of the access road segment closest to the water. They relied entirely on my tolerance. And I was done being tolerant. But I didn't act immediately. I waited. Every weekend, I watched residents park their cars, unload kayaks, carry coolers. I watched them enjoy something they assumed was theirs. The HOA board scheduled a hearing. They sent me another letter. I didn't attend. Instead, I filed paperwork. Quiet paperwork. Legal notices. Boundary clarifications. No trespassing documentation. All calm. All proper. I knew once this started, it couldn't be undone. And I wanted them to understand something. They weren't evicting a powerless cabin owner. They were challenging the person who controlled their convenience, their comfort, their access. And they had no idea what was coming next. I didn't block anything right away. That's important. People think revenge stories are about sudden explosions. Gates slammed shut. Signs thrown up overnight. That's not how real life works. Real consequences move slowly at first. Quietly. On paper. The first thing I did was send certified letters. One to the HOA board. One to their attorney. One to the property management company. Each letter was polite. Almost boring. It explained the boundaries of my land. Attached copies of the deed. Included a fresh survey map. The final paragraph was simple. Any continued use of my property for parking, lake access, or foot traffic would require a formal agreement. Until then, access was revoked. No threats. No emotion. Just facts. I mailed them on a Monday. By Friday, the phone calls started. The HOA president called first. Her voice sounded different this time. Tighter. Less confident. She said there had to be a misunderstanding. She said residents had always used that area. I told her that was true, and that it was by my permission. She said the HOA would review the documents. I said that was fine. Then I hung up. That weekend, I went to the cabin early. Friday morning instead of evening. I parked my truck at the edge of the gravel lot. Just parked it there. Not blocking. Not fencing. Just occupying my own land. By noon, cars started arriving. People slowed down. Rolled down windows. One man asked if there was an event. I said no. Another asked where everyone was supposed to park. I shrugged and said, I'm not sure. This is private land. Some people left. Some parked farther away and walked. No yelling. No scenes. Just confusion. Saturday morning was different. The HOA sent someone. Not the president. A board member I'd never met. Middle-aged guy. Nervous smile. He said he wanted to talk neighbor to neighbor. We stood by the lake. He said residents were upset. He said the board didn't realize the land situation. I asked him why they tried to evict me without realizing it. He didn't answer. He said maybe we could work something out. I told him I was open to formal agreements. Paid agreements. With liability coverage. His smile disappeared. He said the HOA didn't budget for that. I said that wasn't my problem. By Sunday evening, someone had moved my truck slightly. Not far. Just enough to open space. That's when I knew they still didn't respect the line. So on Monday, I escalated. I installed signs. Nothing aggressive. White signs. Black lettering. Private property. No parking without written permission. I placed them where they were visible. Clear. Undeniable. I also sent a follow-up letter. This one stated that unauthorized vehicles would be documented and towed if necessary. I hated doing that part. I didn't want to hurt families. Or ruin weekends. But they forced my hand when they tried to erase me. Tuesday morning, the HOA attorney called. This time, his voice wasn't calm. He said the board disputed my claims. He said they believed there was an implied easement. I asked him to show me. He couldn't. He asked if we could meet. I agreed. The meeting was at their clubhouse, a place I'd never been invited before. 5 board members. The attorney. Me. They talked first. They said my cabin violated aesthetic standards. They said the lake was marketed as a community feature. They said revoking access would harm residents. When it was my turn, I spoke slowly. I told them I never joined their HOA. I told them my land predated their development. I told them their eviction notice had crossed a legal line. Then I asked a simple question. Why did you think you could remove me? No one answered. The attorney shifted in his seat. I slid copies of the deeds across the table. Highlighted sections. Survey maps. I told them I wasn't interested in fighting. But I wouldn't be bullied out of my own property. The HOA president finally spoke. She said the eviction notice was a procedural error. That's when I almost laughed. Instead, I asked if it was withdrawn. She hesitated, then nodded. I told them that was step 1. Step 2 was addressing access. They asked what I wanted. I told them. A formal lease for parking use. Limited lake access hours. Insurance coverage. Annual compensation. The room went silent. They said the residents wouldn't approve it. I said then residents wouldn't park there. The meeting ended badly. No agreement. No handshake. That weekend, the first tow happened. A car left overnight on my land. I waited until morning. Called a local tow company. Showed them the documents. They hooked the car and drove away. By noon, my phone was blowing up. Angry messages. Accusations. Threats to call the county. I stayed quiet. The HOA posted notices blaming an individual landowner. They tried to paint me as greedy. But something unexpected happened. Residents started asking questions. They learned the lake wasn't HOA owned. They learned the parking wasn't guaranteed. They learned the board had tried to evict someone who actually owned the ground they stood on. Trust cracked. The HOA president called again Sunday night. Her voice was sharp. She said this was turning into a disaster. I told her disasters usually start with bad decisions. I reminded her who made the first one. And I told her something else. I wasn't done yet. Because the eviction notice had consequences. Legal ones. And next, I was going to address that. The eviction notice never left my mind. Even after the towing. Even after the signs. Even after the HOA started to panic. Because that notice wasn't just rude. It was reckless. They hadn't just tried to pressure me. They had tried to remove me from land I legally owned. That mattered. On Monday morning, I met with my attorney again. Local guy. Gray hair. Straight shooter. I laid everything out. The letters. The eviction notice. The towing incident. The meeting. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he leaned back and said something simple. They overreached. That was the confirmation I needed. He explained it calmly. The HOA had no authority over my property. Issuing an eviction notice implied jurisdiction they didn't have. That exposed them to liability. Especially because they did it formally. On letterhead. Through their attorney. It wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a recorded action. He asked me what I wanted. That was the hardest part. I didn't want to destroy anyone. I didn't want to bankrupt families. I just wanted my peace back. And accountability. We decided on a measured approach. First, a demand letter. Not emotional. Not aggressive. Clear. It demanded a written retraction of the eviction notice. An acknowledgement of my property rights. and reimbursement for legal fees incurred responding to their action. It also warned that continued interference could escalate into a civil claim. We sent it certified. That afternoon, things started moving fast. The HOA president emailed me directly. No smile this time. No polite tone. She said residents were furious. She said cars were being towed unfairly. She said the board was under pressure. I didn't respond. That night, someone removed one of my signs. I noticed it immediately. The next morning, I replaced it. And added a small camera. Nothing hidden. Clearly visible. I wasn't trying to trap anyone. I just wanted documentation. By Wednesday, residents started approaching me directly. Not angry. Confused. One woman asked why the HOA said the lake was community-owned if it wasn't. I told her the truth. Another man apologized for parking on my land without asking. I thanked him. Word spreads differently when facts enter the picture. Thursday evening, I received a message from a board member. Not the president. He said he didn't agree with how things were handled. He said the eviction idea was pushed through quickly. He said some board members felt trapped now. That told me everything. They acted first, thought later, and now they were losing control. The demand letter arrived on Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, my attorney got a call. The HOA attorney again. This time, there was no confidence left in his voice. He asked if we could resolve this amicably. My attorney said that depended on the response. Saturday morning, the HOA posted a new notice. This one was softer. It said parking near the lake was temporarily unavailable due to a boundary review. No mention of me. No blame. Residents noticed. Some were angry. Some relieved. Some started questioning leadership openly. That afternoon, the HOA president showed up at my cabin. Unannounced. She stood on the edge of the gravel lot. Didn't come closer. She asked if we could talk. I said yes. We sat on the porch. She looked tired. She said the board underestimated the situation. She said they thought the eviction notice would force compliance. I asked her compliance with what? She didn't answer. She admitted they never verified ownership before acting. That was the first real admission. She asked if I would consider restoring access temporarily. I asked why. She said residents were threatening to vote out the board. I told her that wasn't my concern. I told her the situation existed because they tried to remove me from my home. She asked what it would take to end this. I told her. Written retraction. Public clarification to residents. A formal agreement proposal. No shortcuts. She said the board would never agree to pay for parking. I said then the board would change. She left without another word. The next week was chaos for them. Emails leaked. Residents demanded copies of governing documents. People realized how little the board actually owned. The lake had been used in marketing photos, in listings, in HOA newsletters. But legally, it wasn't theirs. That revelation hit hard. The board called an emergency meeting. Residents packed the clubhouse. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. By Wednesday, my attorney received a revised letter. It formally withdrew the eviction notice. It acknowledged my ownership. It requested mediation. That was progress. But it wasn't enough. Because withdrawing a notice quietly doesn't undo damage. People had seen it. Neighbors had whispered. Stress had been caused. I told my attorney to respond with conditions. Public acknowledgement. No future enforcement attempts. And compensation for legal costs. The HOA pushed back. They offered partial fees. We declined. That's when the residents stepped in. A petition circulated, calling for a vote of no confidence in the board. By the end of the week, 2 board members resigned. including the one who first knocked on my door months ago. The HOA president called me again. Her voice was different now. Not angry. Not demanding. Resigned. She said the board would agree to my terms. She said they had no choice. I told her to put it in writing, because words had already failed once. At the end of that week, I stood by the lake again. It was quieter. No cars. No crowds. Just water and wind. The way it was when I bought the place. But I knew this wasn't over. Because even if the board surrendered, the story wasn't finished. Residents would still react. And the final consequences were coming next. The document arrived in the mail on a Thursday. Plain envelope. No logo. No drama. Inside was a revised HOA charter amendment. It wasn't addressed to me directly. It was sent to all homeowners. But my situation had clearly shaped it. The amendment stated that the HOA would no longer claim authority over any property without verified ownership or recorded easements. Any enforcement action would require legal review and documentation before notices could be issued. No assumptions. No shortcuts. It passed with overwhelming support. That was the moment I finally exhaled. Not because I won, but because the threat was gone. They couldn't do this again. Not to me. Not to anyone. That mattered more than fees or apologies. I framed my copy of the original deed instead. Not out of spite. Out of reminder. The cabin wasn't just a structure. It was proof of patience. Of long-term thinking. Of choosing quiet when the world chases control. Sometimes I think about how differently this could have gone. If I'd panicked. If I'd argued emotionally. If I'd tried to match their aggression. I might have lost. Instead, I stayed slow. Documented everything. Spoke when it mattered. That's what people don't tell you about standing up to power. You don't need to be loud. You need to be correct. The lake looks different now. Not physically, but emotionally. It feels earned again. When I sit there in the evenings, there's no tension in my shoulders. No wondering who might knock next. Just water, wind, time. Occasionally, new residents move in. They hear bits of the story. Sometimes they ask me if it's true. I tell them yes. And then I tell them something else. Always read your deed. Always know where you stand. Because systems aren't evil by default. But they are lazy. They push until they meet resistance. And when they do, they retreat. The HOA still exists. They still enforce rules. But now, they ask first. That's the real change. I didn't set out to teach a lesson. I just wanted to keep my home. But in the end, the lesson stuck. Ownership isn't just paperwork. It's presence. It's awareness. It's knowing when to say no. The day I first saw that eviction notice, I felt small. That feeling is dangerous. Because it's what bullies rely on. But the moment I stood on my land and refused to move, that feeling disappeared. And it never came back. Now, when I lock the cabin door and head back to town, I don't look over my shoulder. I look at the lake one last time. And I smile. Because it's still mine.